Okay, well, I'm David Croft and I'm the director of the Fowlers Gap Research Station. I'm also a senior lecturer in the School of Biological Earth and Environmental Sciences at the University of New South Wales. So Fowlers Gap Research Station is a Western lands lease in New South Wales, and that lease is held in perpetuity by the University of New South Wales. And I'll just go through a bit of the background as to how the university came to acquire this particular lease. If we talk to the geologists, then they'd say that we're sitting right now in an inland sea back about 30 million years, and this sort of sea somewhat shaped the structure of this country, mainly because of the salt deposit. So what you have out here is an environment where you have many salt-tolerant plants dominated by a group of shrubs called the Chenopodiaceae, or chenopod's. So we're in chenopod steppe or chenopod shrubland. Dissecting this landscape are creek lines, and these creek lines are usually dominated by river redgums, and beyond the creek lines you find two main groups of trees. One is the acacias, of which the mulga is probably the dominant species, and the other is the belars or black oaks, which is sometimes referred to as the whispering trees. In terms of the history of people in the area, there's certainly a lot of evidence for Aboriginal occupation. The primary function of Fowlers Gap was probably in relationship to being a quarry, because the hills here are capped by siltcrete, and siltcrete is a hard siliceous rock which fractures and produces a nice sort of edge. And so as you wander over Fowlers Gap, not only in the hills you can find the actual quarries, but all across the river flood out of Fowlers Creek you'll find middens, just piles, anomalous piles of stone which were originally hearths or fireplaces, and lots of stone chippings which were presumably just discards of tools that had fractured or blunted and were replaced by other tools. These tools were traded quite widely from this area right up to Arnhem Land, and there was other trade coming back from Arnhem Land. Fowlers Gap is considered to be by some on a song line which links together Mutawinji, which is obviously a fairly significant spiritual site with a lot of rock carvings. To the south there's another area of rock carvings which are on Sturt's Meadows, a neighbouring station. And then just to the north east is Lake Bankanya, which would have been a very good foraging area. So the interesting thing about the hydrology and topography of this area is that there's been a big downfaulting which led to what's called the Bankanya Trough, and all the major creeks drain into this Bankanya Trough in a series of lakes and playas which go up, start just north of Broken Hill and go all the way up to Tibooburra, when you finally get into another basin, which is the Lake Eyre Basin, but just right in the top corner of the state. In terms of European history, we're firmly linked with Charles Sturt. Charles Sturt was one of the more heroic, perhaps one of the most heroic of the inland explorers. He was certainly the first. His name carries on in this area with Sturt National Park. Some people go up to that area because of two more infamous characters, Burke and Wills, who actually failed in their expedition and died, and that's sometimes a bit anomalous that those explorers who were successful and lived are less well known than those who failed and died. But anyway, we know that Sturt came through this area because he left one of the creeks named after one of his lieutenants, Flood. So Flood's Creek is a tributary of Fowlers Creek, and Fowlers Creek is a defining part of Fowlers Gap. Fowler himself was certainly not part of Sturt's expedition, but so Sturt came through in 1845. Not long after Sturt came through, there was obviously interest in pastoralism, there was also interest in mining, and that was accelerated by discoveries in Silverton and then later in Broken Hill, which led to the large mining influence in Broken Hill, and that influence spread out over about a 100-kilometre radius from Broken Hill. In addition to this, up here at Milparinka on the Albert Goldfields, there was gold discoveries, and that brought further people into this area. So Fowler left his mark because he is believed to have discovered the gap through the barrier ranges, which takes you from the Broken Hill side into the Bankanya Trough side, and then takes you right up to the then Albert Goldfields in Milparinka and up to Tibooburra, which also itself became an alluvial goldfield. So the significance of this gap was to allow bullock trains to cart goods from Broken Hill area up to the Albert Goldfields, so that it enabled them to cut through this range without going over a steep incline. And the evidence of this bullock train network is still apparent from the old hotels that lay about every 22 miles along the Silver City Highway, including an old hotel on Fowlers Gap. In terms of the pastoral history, then the mining in Broken Hill was also influential there, in that Fowlers Gap was an outstation of Corona. So what was meant by an outstation is that the properties when they were first occupied were very large, hundreds of thousands of hectares rather than thousands of hectares these days, and they were so large that you had shepherds living out on the margins of the properties, and they would then be monitoring the boundaries, or they would be looking after flocks of sheep out on the boundaries. And Corona was owned by Sydney Kidman, who's famous as the Cattle King, and his brother owned a neighbouring property which included Sturt's Meadows, and they were using these properties not only for wool production but also to supply the miners in Broken Hill with mutton, and they actually for a time had a butcher shop in Broken Hill, so they were actually supplying their own butcher shop from mutton they were producing on their properties. In the 1890s there was one of the inevitable droughts, and this produced a major crash in the wool industry, and there was an investigation of why this crash came about in 1901, a Royal Commission, and the Royal Commission decided that two things, that basically the land holdings need to be broken up into more manageable units, and that would also enable more people to live in this area, because there'd been an influx of people with mining. Some of the mining had declined, and some of those people wanted to stay in rural industries, and so the large holdings like Corona were broken up into homestead blocks. These homestead blocks in those days were around about 100,000 acres or 40,000 hectares, and the Fowlers Gap block was taken over by the Campbell family, and the Campbell family occupied it for a number of decades, and their original homestead can be found at the confluence of Fowlers Creek and Homestead Creek. There seemed to be, even in those days, a lack of awareness of the nature of this environment, particularly the La Nina events, the very high rainfall events, which are rare enough but come every 25 years or so, because the homestead was destroyed in a flood. And as you go around many of the properties out here, you'll find that many of the original homesteads, many of the original wool sheds were also destroyed in floods. So there's been for many decades a lack of understanding about this environment. Perhaps we're finally getting some understanding, but really the understanding we've come to about this environment is it's extremely unpredictable. So in other words, you're always looking at a moving target and can never hit that target. In terms of the history of research here, in the 1930s the Minister of Lands for the New South Wales government went to the Midwest of the US, which at that time was a dust bowl, and is quite famous for the drought and the shifting sands. The same thing was happening out here in the Western Division of New South Wales, so he became concerned that there was going to be a dust bowl here. If you talk to people who are of that generation, there's a few of them still around, they talk about sand piling up against their homesteads and their fences, something that doesn't happen very much today. So they commissioned a botanist, Beadle, who came out here and established some reference sites on Fowlers Gap for vegetation. And this was the start of research, so it started right back in the 40s. Beadle worked for the Department of Agriculture. He was at Sydney University and then ended up at University of New England as a professor of botany. And not long after Beadle started this research effort, the lease for Fowlers Gap came to an end for the Campbell family, and the Campbell family didn't renew, and the lease was taken over by the then Soil Conservation Commission, and the Soil Conservation Commission is now part of the Department of Natural Resources, but was an individual department in those days. And they started some research on looking at reclamation of the land in one particular paddock, which is called Conservation, which was destocked at that time and taken out of production. So there's quite a lot of early research there. They did a lot of research on the flora and also looking at landscape processes, geomorphology, hydrology. As with many government departments, their ability to maintain an exclusive research station was based on political will and funding, and that seemed to decline after a few years. So they sublet Fowlers Gap to a local grazier, Owen Hayes, and he had a lease for about 20 years. He was offered a lease for about 20 years. Given he had a 20-year lease, he overexploited the area because there was no long-term commitment for him, and given that the highway runs through Fowlers Gap, it became a bit of an embarrassment for the Soil Conservation Commission, since it was not obviously a well-managed property and was actually running in the direction that they were trying to manage. In other words, it was becoming eroded and degraded. The first Vice-Chancellor of the University of New South Wales, Philip Baxter, was a friend of the Minister of Lands in the Askin government, who was Tom Lewis. And Tom Lewis basically offered this and a number of other Crown properties to the university to create fill stations. At one stage the university had fill stations here at Fowlers Gap, on the coast north of Sydney, up near Bulladila. It still has a Smiths Lake fill station. At Hay, it still has the Hay fill station on at Wellington. It fitted in quite well with the university to have a fill station out here north of Broken Hill, because there was a college in Broken Hill teaching geology and mining engineering of the university. So initially Fowlers Gap was managed by that college. The university also had a School of Wool and Pastoral Sciences, and so they came out and had a very active research program in looking at wool production here and management of sheep in the pastoral zone. And at that time wool was quite valuable, so there was quite a lot of research money, which subsequently declined through the 80s, and so eventually that particular school was disestablished. Likewise, the resources boom of the 70s declined through the 80s, and the university also disestablished the college in Broken Hill. So that you might have thought Fowlers Gap might have gone the same way, but there were two other sort of main threads of research. One was the biological research, which was largely focused on kangaroos, and also there was a certain amount of focus on chenopod shrubland, and the other focus was on geomorphology, and this was led by Professor Jack Mabbott, and the research on kangaroos was initially led by Professor Jeff Sharman and then latterly Professor Terry Dawson. And the research on the kingpod shrubland was led by botanist Professor Derek Anderson. So these two threads were well supported by grants and continued. Jack Mabbott eventually left the university, and so that particular thread went into some decline, and there hasn't been a lot of geomorphological research in the late 90s, but the baton has been taken up by people at ANU and the University of Adelaide, so we've got a sort of renaissance on that. It's not to say that there were not other faculties involved here. There was quite a strong presence by civil engineering, who are looking at water resources and harvesting of water across this landscape. So they had quite an extensive research program in hydrology for a number of years, going into more than a decade of research. There was also other faculties who came and did various things. So the architecture came here in the late 70s, and they built a house, Soul Arch Mark I. They've gone on to build many other houses of this kind. And this was a passive solar design, and that house still stands today and continues to function. Not quite, it was a very ambitious program, but it still functions in that passive solar mode. Other people, like psychologists, have come out here and looked at how people cope with living in remote areas. They spent a lot of time sitting in pubs doing that, so it was no doubt fairly enjoyable sort of research. And then we had the artists coming once the university acquired College of Fine Arts and developed the College of Fine Arts. We had artists starting to come, led by Terry O'Donnell along with Idris Murphy. And that's now become perhaps the third thread, and it's taken over where the pastoral sheep management has gone into decline. So we now have those three threads, with art being one of them. So we have art, still the biological thread, mainly now with, not so much with kangaroos, but with the avifauna, the birds, and we have the geomorphology, geological thread as well. Now what we'd like to think about Fowlers Gap is that it can be a meeting place of people who are interested in natural resources, people who are interested in the history of the landscape through its geology, geomorphology, and ongoing processes in that landscape, such as the hydrology, and artists. And all of these people can sit down and look at this landscape and interpret it. So the mission for the station, we feel, is in four parts. One is what you'd expect of a university, which is teaching and research. The third part is interpretation of the landscape. So this may be by way of publication of scientific papers, but also by way of production of creative works. And the fourth part is diffusion of this knowledge, and this is of course by exhibition and also to some extent by publication, but also by bringing people onto the station for various events, small conferences, workshops. Bringing in the media. We've had in the past quite a lot of interest from wildlife production houses, wildlife documentary production houses. So we've had all the famous ones: BBC Wild Natural History Unit, ABC Natural History Unit, the National Geographic and the Discovery Channel, all main programs out here. So we see this as a way of diffusing knowledge. So we feel it should be also a commitment to public education, not only education of the university students and the students of other institutions. In terms of the Ochre House, how does the Ochre House fit into it? We decided with the activity of some very energetic geography students back in the mid-90s to go into this interpretation of the station by putting in some eco trails or walking trails, and their most ambitious walking trail came all the way out here and was an 8-hour trail, and then wandered through the gorge in which the Oak House sits. That's the Sandy Creek Gorge. And so we decided that to make this most effective, we should have some sort of overnight accommodation so people could come out on this walking trail and spend a bit of time here. So off the back of an investment in the land, we bought a shed, and the shed turned out to be quite a more substantial structure than we thought, just looking at it on a small picture on the investment. And so we put it up, and then we brought out the artists to have a look, and then they embraced it as having a lot of potential for their ideas of having some sort of retreat for artists to come. The idea of a retreat also appealed to us in terms of ecotourism and ecotourism management. One of the reasons why people come to the desert, come to the arid zone, is solitude, peace, finding oneself, and so I think there's been a bit of an emphasis in tourism to try and recruit people into mass tourism, or small, relatively small, intimate tour groups, but there's been a sort of lack of producing this sort of retreat. There's been a few attempts around the place, so we see this as also a way of sort of inspiring people to think about that sort of market, where people can come for a retreat, whatever their reason. Obviously creative people are going to be our main market here, but it might be other people who are simply interested to come for a period of quiet contemplation. We see the Oak House itself as being Mark 1, so it's a work in progress. From feedback from the users, we'll make some modifications and we'll try and improve its functionality, and then we'll take that information to create some other similar houses or similar retreats on the station. Perhaps 3, 4, 5, we don't know how many we'll get, but in different landscapes in the station, so people can go around and look at these landscapes.